So good afternoon, everybody. As Aaron has just introduced me, I'm Alister. A couple of little housekeeping things. So for my events, when I'm doing a real event and we're all face to face, which hopefully we'll all get back to soon, I really like to have questions and answers as we go. There will be some time at the end of the session for a Q&A. I will make sure that we have some time for that. But I'm going to be talking about a lot of things in the next 40 to 45 minutes about this camera. So if you do have a question that's relevant, do please ask it using the Q&A panel. Type in your question. I can see my computer from here, and I will answer any questions that come up that as relevant before we forget perhaps what that question you wanted to ask was. So yes, there'll be time at the end, but do please ask questions whenever you want. I really do invite that. It can make the session much more interesting, actually. So my story, as it were, with the FX9 is I'm a long-time Sony user, as most of you will know. I've been using Sony cameras all of my career because they, in Europe certainly, and a lot of Asia, the Sony codecs, the Sony workflow, the Sony infrastructure is something that everybody knows and everybody understands. And a broadcaster investing in Sony knows that the equipment will work, it will do what Sony say, and it will be very reliable. And as a freelance cameraman, if you're going to invest in a camera, reliability is really super important. You're putting a lot of money into that camera, and if you turn up on a shoot and it doesn't work, it's more than just inconvenient. It's embarrassing for you because it's your camera and it's not working. You can't do the job, so then it leads to an incredibly stressful time while perhaps you're trying to borrow or hire or find another camera from somewhere, which actually is one of the benefits of Sony, is that if a camera does, let's say, go wrong, it's extremely rare. There are so many Sony cameras out there that hiring and finding another camera to replace one that isn't working, perhaps it's gone missing, something's happened, is normally quite easy. So, that's one reason to be in this Sony ecosystem. So I like to stay in the Sony ecosystem because I trust the products, I know they work, I know what they do what they're supposed to do, and generally the specifications are very, very good. And the FX9 was a logical step from the FS7, and also for me actually the F5 and 55 that I also owned, because of the trend now moving to a full frame sensor for that shallow depth of field look. To get that very film-like look, we have Sony's new S-Cinetone, which I'll talk about it as we go along, and really good value for the money. In terms of what you get for what this camera costs, it's a tremendous, powerful package. It can do an amazing range of things, especially if you do documentaries and news and all of those things. It's a really versatile camera. So my story with the camera starts way, way back when it was first announced. And then as soon as I saw the specifications, I knew it was a camera that I would find incredibly useful because it ticked all the boxes: full frame, great codecs, good quality images, 6K oversampling sensor, and all of those things. So I decided to get one. And this is my own personal FX9. And this has pretty much been around the world with me. Now, of course, we all know that the last year or so has been very different to a normal year. Most of us haven't been able to shoot as much as we would do normally. That includes myself. In the UK, we were locked down for pretty much 6 to 7 months of the year and really not able to do most of what we could normally do, certainly not in the same way. And in terms of travel, that's virtually stopped altogether, and it's only just now starting very slowly to come back. But my adventures with this camera started actually in Norway. Now, I am going to show you some videos today. The videos that you're going to see via this WebEx meeting, the quality will not be the full quality that is possible from this camera. So don't use this to judge the quality of the images. But I'm going to use the videos to demonstrate what it is that I've done with the camera and why the FX9 was the right camera for the jobs that I'm going to show you. the videos will be available online, and we'll try and email out the links to you to those videos so you can watch them in their full quality. So the first adventure that I had, don't worry, I'm just looking at my laptop to queue up a video, was to actually take the FX9 up to Norway. Now this is something that I do almost every year, so let me just start the video for you. Let me just check the levels aren't too high. Right, so I can talk over the video, you should be able to hear me. So, the FX9 up in Norway, and one of the key features of the FX9 for these particular trips was, of course, low light capability. In Norway, in the winter time, which is when we go, this is in January, it's only daylight for a couple of hours. And in fact, if I just rewind this shot a little bit, you'll see that that is about as high as the sun gets above the horizon. It doesn't get any higher than that. And you can see actually that compared to a sunset in Asia, where the sun goes up and almost straight up and straight down, it sort of skims along the horizon. Now this is one of the types of shots that is really easy to do with the FX9, and it's one of the reasons why I like the FX9 so much, because the camera has a built-in intervalometer. So that allows you to shoot time-lapse with the camera really easily and really well. Now, some people prefer perhaps to do time-lapse with a stills camera, with a Sony Alpha perhaps, and there's definitely reasons why you might want to do that. But when I'm traveling up to Norway, wrong camera, when I'm traveling up to Norway, I need to be very portable. We travel around on snow scooters. Now, the other thing that I like to do a lot of, I've just paused the video, is to shoot the Northern Lights. That's the reason why I go to Norway. And you have to understand that the Northern Lights, they are not bright most of the time. Most of the time they are extremely faint. And in fact, when I shot this video, you could barely see them with your own eyes. They were really dim. And in fact, you can tell that because when you look at the video, look at how bright the stars are. So this means that this is a long exposure. Now this wasn't done with an Alpha or anything like that. This was shot with the FX9. And the FX9 has a lovely feature in it which is called the slow shutter. And you can combine the slow shutter with the time-lapse function to get an exposure of up to about 3 seconds. So you can shoot at incredibly low light levels. And then on top of that, of course, the FX9 has dual ISO. Just pause this for a moment. Now, dual ISO allows you to shoot at 2 different sensitivity levels. So we can shoot at, if we're shooting log, we can shoot at 800 ISO, or we can shoot at 4000 ISO. Now that gap between those 2 ISOs is really important, how big that gap is. Now, the shots that you're seeing here inside this workshop, if we look, there's a shot in a moment where we see the window here, there. Now that's as bright as it gets in the middle of the day in Norway in the winter. It's really very, very dim. And the lights in this little workshop weren't very bright. Now this guy, he makes, he runs a dog sledding team, and he makes all the harnesses, he makes all of the things that the dog sleds need out of natural materials. So he makes them in his workshop. It's a really quite amazing place to visit. But it was really dark in that workshop. It wasn't a bright workshop. Now it was too dark to shoot S-Log3 at 800 ISO, so I was able to go up to 4000 ISO and shoot the S-Log3, and that was pretty much the perfect ISO for that particular environment. And in fact, for most indoor environments where it's lit to at least some degree, you don't need insane high ISOs, and 4000 ISO is a really great ISO. The FX6, which I'm sure you're all aware of, has 2 ISOs as well, but its ISOs are 800 and 12,800. And to be honest, 12,800 for drama, for documentary, for a lot of this style of shooting is too high. It would just be far too much. I'd have to probably shoot at 12,800 ISO and then use the ND filter to bring that down, which is crazy. 4000 ISO is a much nicer place to be. Now, a question that's come in is, do I use the Auto ND on daylight FX9 time lapses? And the answer is absolutely yes. If you need it, And if you perhaps want to use a slower shutter speed, because this is the real nice thing about the auto ND or the variable ND filter, is it allows you to shoot time-lapse during the day. You can put in that full 8 stops of ND, 128th ND, and you can then start to use slower shutter speeds if you want a smoother, more blurry motion to the clouds going across the sky and things like that. So yeah, if it's appropriate, you can use it. And the auto ND is particularly useful because it will compensate for the way the light changes during your shot if you need to. Now the shots in this video, the sunrise and there's a sunset shot coming up, I didn't really need to use auto ND because the light didn't change that much from the beginning of the shot to the end of the shot. But I use it a lot, especially if you're going from night to day. So often if I'm doing a nighttime to daytime shot, I'll start the camera at the high base ISO with ND, and then the ND will automatically reduce. And one of the things that you can do, let me bring the camera output up for a minute. So this is the output of my FX9 right here. If I go into the menu and we go to the shooting menu and we go down to auto exposure here, you can see that we've got lots of ways of driving the auto exposure. And this changes the way the auto ND works. And one of the most useful features is this speed control. And if I go way down, I typically, if I'm doing a time lapse or something like that, I'll have this down at -60, -70. And it slows down the way the auto exposure functions. So as an example, if you were shooting a time lapse during the day and there's a glint of light off something, or there's a very quick change in the light where maybe just for a moment the sun comes from behind a cloud, the auto ND isn't going to respond to that. So you're not going to get flickering in your time-lapse sequence. It will only really respond to much more gradual, longer changes in the overall light, which is what you want with a time-lapse. And that speed setting is so useful to be able to control exactly how quickly the auto exposure system responds, which in turn, of course, changes the way the auto ND works. And we can really sort of change things, like we can change how where we switch from auto ISO perhaps to auto ND and things like that using these controls in the camera. And it's one of the FX9's real strengths, is that ability to really control what's going on. Now coming back to the video here, so these are dog sleds that we went on. Now of course the other great thing about the FX9 is auto exposure. Great, we talked about that already, is autofocus. The FX9 has Sony's latest autofocus system, and it is radically different to what came before. If you have an FS7 and you use the autofocus on the FS7, it works, kind of, sort of, on a good day, if the lighting is just right, your lens is just right and everything else. The autofocus with the FX9 is something completely different, and I will come on to that in a little bit. So these shots here, they're done with autofocus. Now bear in mind, when I shot this, it's actually about -30 degrees. It's incredibly cold. So I have huge big mittens on my hands so I don't get frostbite on my fingers. So trying to operate a manual lens like this, perhaps with very small focus rings and things like that, with great big thick gloves on, is actually really difficult. And we're traveling on the snow scooters, so we're having to sort of get in front of the dog team, grab the shot and move on. So this is all done with autofocus and using face priority so that it locks onto the faces of the people, and it just works absolutely brilliantly. It just made shooting something like this so much easier than when I've done it in the past, and it just works superbly well. And it really made this a much easier thing to do. Of the footage that I shot, much more of it was usable. Here's more time-lapse. Again, because the light doesn't change greatly from the beginning to the end of the shot, I didn't use ND or auto exposure, because actually sometimes you actually want the shot to go dark because you want to portray that change from daytime to nighttime. And this is all -30 degrees. It's incredibly cold, well beyond the temperatures that that Sony actually recommend the cameras should be used in. But I've never had a problem. Batteries don't last as long when it's that cold and things like that, but generally speaking the camera functions perfectly well. More northern lights, but unfortunately we had quite a bit of cloud, didn't always get exactly everything that I wanted. So that was my sort of first real in the wild adventure with the FX9, doing something that I've done a lot. I've been out to Norway, I think it's now 11 times, maybe more than that, in the winter to do that. And of all the trips that I've done, that one was the easiest because the camera made it really easy because of the features that it has. And I'm just queuing up a picture here because I think this is a little bit of fun. And that's what the camera looked like shooting the northern lights, covered in ice and frost. It's really, really cold, and of course that's me all wrapped up in all my winter gear filming the northern lights. So you can see the challenges that we have trying to film in that environment. Now from there I had a very different trip next with the camera, and that was from Norway to Dubai. So I went to Dubai in the Middle East to do the FX9 launch out in Dubai. So it's a very, very different set of circumstances. Now, something I didn't mention actually about the Norway video is that most of that was shot with S-Log3 and then graded in post-production. So the shots in the workshop, all the exterior daytime shots, it's all S-Log3 and graded. And that's a workflow I'm very familiar with, so I was quite confident and happy to do that. But for Dubai, we decided to do things a little bit differently and to prioritize S-Cinetone. So S-Cinetone is Sony's new color space, color science, and what it gives you is a really easy way to get great pictures straight out of the camera without post-production, without grading, without all the complexity of that. Now, it's not going to be for everybody, but if you're somebody that does quick turnaround work, if you're doing television news, if you're doing documentaries where you're not going to grade, or perhaps you're not very good at grading, not all of us are good at grading, having this S-Cinetone where straight out of the camera, it looks fantastic, makes life really easy, and it means you can have a very fast turnaround. So let me just show you some of the video from Dubai. So this is what we shot in Dubai. And as you're going to see, very, very different. And it's all S-Cinetone. So this is out in the desert. We didn't have amazing weather. It was quite cloudy. Very attractive model. Deliberately chose the strong reds and the really strong colours to really emphasise the way the S-Cinetone looks. But the thing about S-Cinetone is it has incredible dynamic range compared to an ordinary Rec 709. So if I'd tried to shoot this with an ordinary Rec 709 camera, it would have really struggled. Because as you're going to see here, we're shooting straight into the sun. And even though we're shooting directly into the sun, it's incredibly backlit and everything else. I'm just going to pause this. The way the camera handles that highlight and rolls off into the highlights is really amazing. Considering this isn't log, considering this isn't graded, considering that this is straight out of the camera, what this camera delivers with S-Cinetone in really challenging light is quite remarkable. I couldn't have done this, I don't think, and it certainly wouldn't have been as pretty as this with a camera without S-Cinetone. I'd have had to have used log, I would have had to have graded it, and all of those things, all that extra work. Now, after the shoot in the desert, we did the following morning, we went into the city, I think, and we did some other shots. But again, one of the great things about the camera is this time-lapse function with interval record, nice sunset over the city, and again, the low light performance of the camera. So this is in the city at night, just relying on the city street lights. This is just 4000 ISO, no slow shutter or anything else. This is just a regular speed shot. But of course, we can then introduce that time-lapse function, the interval record function, and for these shots, they're shot at 1 frame every 2 seconds, and then using a 64 frame slow shutter. And that gives you that nice blurring of the lights of the cars. So that really sort of gives you this sort of more interesting look than if you used a faster shutter speed. Back to daytime again, out in the city, much brighter, very different day this is actually. We had much stronger light, out shooting the cityscape, and again we can see how the camera with the S-Cinetone really handles that big dynamic range. And this is really one of the things that I like about the FX9, is that if you need to shoot simply, S-Cinetone will allow you to do that. Huge dynamic range, great shots out of the camera. But if you need more control to do stuff in post-production, of course, you have S-Log3, the same as F5, F55, etc., but with improved sensor performance, because of course we have a 6K sensor. Now, what does that sort of 6K sensor mean? Let me just make sure I'm not missing anything that I intended to talk about. Well, that 6K sensor gives you tremendous flexibility to use different lenses. Now, if we look at the front of the camera here, at the moment you can see that the lens that I'm using is a Fujinon MK lens. These are really great, affordable, cinema-style zoom lenses. There's really nothing else quite comparable to these lenses in the market. So that gives you that real film style shooting. It gives you proper calibrated focus scales. It gives you a really long focus travel. So if you're using your follow focus motors and things like that, this works beautifully well. But there's potentially a problem with a lot of cinema lenses. And that is that people have been making films and movies for almost for 100 years. But for the majority of the modern era of filmmaking, the primary type of lens that's been used is the PL mount super 35mm lens. So you need a camera, if you want to use the vast range of beautiful cinema lenses that are out there today, a camera that can shoot super 35. And that's one of the real key things about the FX9, is we have this 6K full frame sensor in the front of the camera, and because it's 6K and full frame, it does excellent 4K super 35. So that means that we can use all of the PL mount cinema lenses that are out there on this camera. Now the FX6 is a 4K full frame sensor, and because of that it can't shoot super 35 in 4K. It can do HD at super 35 but not 4K. But if you're making a movie, if you're doing drama, if you're doing a high-end production today, I really think it needs to be shot at 4K. Netflix, all of those big players, they're producing in 4K. If you want to do something for Netflix, it has to be in 4K. It's going to be much harder to sell HD content now, and it's going to get harder and harder in the future because 4K is commonplace now. My phone shoots 4K. So, if I want to shoot 4K for a drama, something like that, I'm going to have to use the FX9. Can't use the FX6, doesn't have that capability. And the FX9, also the other really great feature if you're doing drama, let's have a look at the front of the camera, is the locking E-mount here. And this is really key if you're using follow focus motors or anything that drives or turns the lens, because this lens cannot turn. It's absolutely rock solid on the camera. With the ordinary E-mount that just goes in, turns and clicks, there's a tiny bit of movement. It's not much, but it's there. And if you're using a follow focus motor, each time the motor changes direction, the lens just moves a tiny little bit. And that then causes some deflection in the image that you see. So you see the frame either just go up and down, or whatever angle the follow focus motor is at. So it's really important that we have this locking mount. The locking mount's really easy to use. If I just flip up the little switch here, turn the ring, lens comes off, and I'm going to put on a different lens now. This is actually the lens that I took to Norway, and this is a lens I use an awful lot actually. Let's just lock that on. There we go. That's on, nice and easy to fit. And this is Sony's 24 to 240mm zoom lens. It's not a power zoom. You've got to turn the ring yourself. It doesn't have it gets longer and shorter as you zoom in and zoom out, as you can see. But it, of course, has Sony's great autofocus, and it gives you a tremendous zoom range. So if we bring the camera up, so we can see the autofocus here, and we can see that at the moment the camera is set to face priority, and it's picked the mannequin. But if I press the select button now, it will go to the girl in the picture. I can choose any one of the girls, choose them, or we can come back to the mannequin, and we have, you know, this lovely autofocus system on this camera. And the autofocus really is one of the big strengths of this camera. It's great if you're doing interviews, if you're doing things like that, because we can actually choose the face that we're of the interviewee. We can put the camera in its face only mode, and this is I think this is a really important thing to understand. It's face only for interviews, because then it won't be distracted by somebody else or something else in the background. And if it's face only and you've registered that face, so if we've got the box, like I've got the double white box over the mannequin here, it will only focus on that face in the face only mode. It will ignore the other faces, and that's going to stop the autofocus wandering off into the background and doing other things. Now the autofocus in these cameras is very sophisticated. I'm just going to unselect her face by pressing select again, so that's now unselected. We have a lot of possibilities with the autofocus and a lot of control over it. And I think this is one of the things that we need to understand with autofocus now, is that it's not something you just turn on and use. You have to understand how it works, because there's lots of different subtleties about the way it works. And if you have the wrong autofocus settings, it's not necessarily going to do what you want it to do. So if we go into the camera menu and have a look at those settings quickly, we can see, again, it's in the shooting menu, and if I go to focus, we have AF transition speed, which is how quickly the camera moves focus from one place to another. So right now it's set to fast. So if I change, let me see, let's we're on face priority. If I bring my hand in here and block the faces, this isn't the best lens that Sony have for AF. It should, it's still picking up on the faces. It's not going to behave for me now. Let's see, we go a bit wider. Right, so there it's focused on my hand. As soon as I take my hand out, very quickly it focuses on the background, and now it comes back to my hand. Of course, the problem was I had my hand too close to the camera. This doesn't have the shortest of focus distances, but as you can see, the focus is snapping in and out of focus very quickly. Could probably do a bit more light on my hand as well, that helps it. It's a bit dark. So we can see now that with the transition speed set to fast, that focus change happens really quickly. Now if I go to slow at the other end of the scale, and again I bring my hand in, the focus changes, but it's much more slowly. If I take my hand out, you'll see it responds quite, or the change in the focus is much slower. I've got to block the faces because it's in face priority. So the AF speed function, in fact, I'll tell you what, another better way to do this, if I zoom in like this, what should happen now, if I block this face, it'll go to that face quite slowly. Take my hand out, it's going to come back to the other face quite slowly. See, it actually takes quite a while for the focus to change. So that's the AF speed. Now the other one that we have, let's put this back in to fast, is the AF shift sensitivity. And in fact, actually that's why, I just noticed this is on locked on, it wasn't changing to my hand earlier. Because it was set to locked on, the focus is actually ignoring my hand unless it's there for a very long time. I should have checked that. If I set it now to responsive, what we're going to find is as soon as I block that face, the focus will jump straight away. Right, see how much more quickly now the camera is responding to me blocking that face. The focus change is now happening almost instantly because the camera is set now to responsive. If we go back to the menu, if I go back to locked on again now, of course, what will happen is when I bring my hand in, initially the focus isn't going to change. It is because there's such a big change to the shot. But certainly if I do that and things like that, the AF doesn't change because we're in locked on. So locked on is really good if you're shooting perhaps something that's on the other side of the street and there might be traffic or people or cars passing between you and the camera. And then the responsiveness, so it's a locked on, and then you'd have it to responsive if you were perhaps shooting motor racing and you're waiting for that car to suddenly appear in the shot and go around the corner, you want responsive. And then the transition speed, you'd have a slow transition speed, especially if you're doing an interview or something like that. You don't want the focus to suddenly move and go off somewhere else. And you want that slow transition speed if you're doing a drama or something like that, because it tends to look a bit more natural to have a slow change in the focus. But again, if you're doing sports where your subject is moving closer and further from you very quickly, you'd use responsive and fast together. So the AF is something that you need to learn and something that you need to sort of really understand fully. Now, a question that's come in actually is, do I find that the FX9 image quality is a little noisier and softer in Super 35 mode than 5K or 6K full frame? Yes, there's a difference. So 6K, when we shoot with 6K full frame with this camera, we're oversampling. So we're recording in 4K, but the sensor is operating at 6K. Now a Bayer sensor, which is the type of sensor that we have in this camera, won't deliver an image that's the resolution of the number of pixels that it has. So a 6K Bayer sensor delivers a 4K, approximately, image. A 4K Bayer sensor delivers an image that's a little bit less than 4K. It's about just over 3K if you measure the resolution with a chart. So the FS7, FS5, FX6, the resolution that it records is a little bit over 3K, something like that. The FX9 in its 6K full frame mode will deliver a 4K image. So it is going to be that little bit sharper. It is going to have that little bit more resolution. When you go to the 4K Super 35 mode, the resolution is the same as any other 4K Bayer sensor. So it's no worse than an FS7, FS5, FX6. It's not really any different to those cameras, but it's not as good as when you shoot with the sensor in its 6K mode. And the other thing about this camera, in the 6K mode, the way the optical filtering works in this camera and everything else ensures that that 4K image is what I would describe as very well rounded. And this is something that's very difficult to explain to people because it's a really difficult thing to see. But if you look at the images from the FX9, there is just something about them that is really, really nice. And that is because the way the 6K sensor with the optical filter designed for 4K filming works is we actually have a little bit in reserve, for want of a better word, is that the sensor, we're not trying to get every single last drop of resolution out of the sensor. Because we've got a little bit in hand, because the sensor is a 6K sensor, we can be a little gentler with the processing, with the optical filtering and things like that, and we get a really nice, very rounded, very pleasing image that is subtly just that little bit nicer than what you get from a 4K Bayer sensor, where if you have a 4K Bayer sensor, perhaps an FX6, FS7, you're desperately trying to squeeze every last little bit that you can out of that sensor. So you might be a little bit more aggressive with the optical filtering, you might be a little bit more aggressive with the processing to squeeze every last bit that you can. And as a result, it's not perhaps quite as refined as the images that you get from the FX9 when you're shooting 6K full frame. Now, having said all of that, when I do shoot in 4K Super 35, I don't have a problem with the image quality. The image quality is absolutely great. It is a touch noisier, but that's because you're not oversampling. It is a touch lower resolution. And if I put two images side by side up on my monitor, shot at the same time of the same thing, I can see the difference between the 6K and the 4K. But if you were to show your audience a project shot at 4K Super 35, they're not going to say there was something wrong with it. They are not going to think, oh my God, that's horrible, because it's still lower noise than an FS7. We still have the better color science and image quality, the better color science really, that gives us that really nicer skin tones. It gives us better colors. We also, as well as the color science, we have a bigger dynamic range, so we handle highlights and shadows better, and all of those things are still there in the 4K Super 35 mode. So I really don't have any issue shooting 4K Super 35 when it's appropriate. And that opens up this window to use all these cinema lenses and everything else. Just a question coming back to autofocus that's come in is, does the autofocus face priority work even when the subject is not in the center of the frame? Absolutely yes. So the autofocus face priority, it really doesn't matter where the subject is, so long as the camera can see the whole face. Now obviously if the face goes out of frame, it's going to jump to these faces here, or if I go over here, there's no face. But as soon as the face is in the frame, it will focus on it. Now this does depend on the focus area that you're using. So if I come back into here, so we have three different focus areas: wide, zone and flexible spot. The autofocus only operates within the area that you've chosen. So currently I've got it set to wide, and that is, I think it's about 93% of the frame. So there's just the tiniest little strip around the edges of the frame that it doesn't work in. Basically, this is the entire frame. If I set it to zone, you'll see I get this orange box. So now the autofocus is only going to work within that orange box. And I can actually use the touch screen now. So if I touch on the LCD, I can move that box. So if I move it over here now, the autofocus is only going to focus within that area, including the face AF. And you can see now actually that the focus has moved from the mannequin in the foreground to the girls in the picture in the background. And if I move it over here, it's going to focus on the mannequin. So the face AF only works within the box. Now, if I come out of the menu for a minute, one thing that is a little bit confusing, and I think this throws some people off a little bit, is you can see right now that I still have a box around the mannequin on the left side of the frame. But the camera will not focus on her because she is outside of that zone. So it doesn't matter what happens. If she's the only face, the camera still isn't going to focus on her because she's outside of the zone. So if I want the camera to focus on her, she either has to be within that zone, so we could move the zone onto her, and now the camera will focus on her, and it will ignore the faces on the other side of the frame, or we need to go back to the wide area again. So this is a really important thing. If I go to flexible spot, we have an even smaller area. Now if I put the flexible spot over her face, let's just put it over the center of her face, and again I'm touching the screen to move this, I'm using the touch screen. The AF, we can see now, you can see the grey box, which is the flexible spot area, has focused on her. She has the white box around her eye, and it will ignore, it's not going to, the AF won't do anything now on this side of the frame. No matter what happens, the AF is not going to do anything on this side of the frame because it's outside of that flexible spot. You still get the grey boxes because the camera's identified that these are faces, but because they're not within the focus area spot here, it will ignore them. So it won't focus on these faces even though it knows that they're there because they're not within the flexible spot. And actually this is how I would set the camera up if I'm doing an interview with somebody. If I'm interviewing, I will use face priority and I will use flexible spot, making sure, where's my finger gone, that the face is within the flexible spot, or if it is a large framing, I might use the zone. The more you can narrow down the area where the autofocus is going to operate over, the better it is with interviews and things like that. Now I'm just going to put this back to wide so I don't forget. And of course you can assign these to an assignable button. I'm trying to think which button I've assigned it to on my camera. So you can assign transition speed, subject shift sensitivity to an assignable button. So I can get into those controls very quickly. I've just got these on this button here, button number 2 on the camera. But there's lots of ways of getting into the AF to change those settings. So moving on, the next project that I want to talk about is a very different one. So let me just find the video for you. Because again, this comes down to this lens mount and the amazing flexibility that it gives you. So being able to use cinema lenses on the camera opens up the possibility to use anamorphic lenses. So this is a video that I shot with Cooke 2x anamorphics. Let's just start that again, see if it'll play it back properly a bit more smoothly, because it shouldn't be juddering. That's a bit better. And there's something about anamorphic lenses that they just have a look. We'll send you the links to these videos so you can watch them properly at higher quality. There is just something about the way the defocused areas look with an anamorphic lens. Now, because the sensor on the FX9 is a full frame sensor, the height of that sensor is absolutely perfect for normal 35mm anamorphic lenses. And in the version 3 firmware for the camera that will come hopefully sometime around the end of the summer, there will be an update that will allow us to have anamorphic monitoring and make shooting anamorphic with the FX9 much, much easier. Now, one of the things that you get with anamorphic is the focus balls, so the areas of the image that are out of focus are distorted. So I just paused the video here because there's a pull focus here. And if you look at the drops of water on the leaves on the tree on the right hand side, when I changed the focus, you can see how they stretch out. And this is part of that anamorphic look. There's a bit of breathing with these lenses, but again, this is part of that look. But when you change the focus changes differently in the horizontal plane to the vertical plane. So if I show you that pull focus again, what you'll see is as I pull focus is the image stretches horizontally, but doesn't really change much vertically. So it just gets wider. And this is part of the anamorphic look. It's generally regarded as a highly desirable look, but to really be able to do that and to be able to shoot with 35mm anamorphic lenses, you need a much taller sensor. And the 6K full frame sensor is absolutely perfect for this. Now, one of the things that you do have to do when you shoot anamorphic with 35mm anamorphic lenses is you do actually have to crop the image. You have to crop the sides off, because if you don't, you'll have a vignette at the sides, because you have to remember that. Let me come out of this video for a second. Oh, there we go, something else. Of course, one of the other classic anamorphic looks is the lens flares. So when you're shooting anamorphic, because of the distortions introduced by the lens, your lens flares spread out horizontally. So you get those wide, classic Star Trek perhaps like lens flares, a very popular look. And it's one of those unique properties of anamorphic. I think it's the next shot or so. And in all of these shots, you can see how the defocus looks. So here we are, typical anamorphic lens flare. Very difficult to reproduce that in post-production accurately, but it's something that anamorphic lenses do. But I'm just going to come out of this video and just bear with me a second and show you a different video, because this is actually a behind the scenes video, because one of the things I want to show you is that when you shoot anamorphic, this is the image that you get before it's been squashed in the viewfinder. An anamorphic 35mm anamorphic lens is designed for 35mm film, and let me find the So that's your 35mm film superimposed over the top of the FX9 sensor. And that's, most ordinary 4K cameras, of course, have a 16:9 Super 35 sensor, which basically fills just this center box here. Just fills that area in the middle. Now the FX9 sensor, now a 35mm film frame, so open gate 35mm frame, is this area here. So we have this part of the frame here. So on an FS7, FS5, etc., where this smaller area in the middle, but a film camera is this much larger frame here. So if you use a ordinary 35mm anamorphic lens on an ordinary 4K camera such as the FS7, the sensor isn't tall enough. So we have a problem. And this video is available online. Now, with a FX9, because the sensor itself is that much taller, we can use the full height of the sensor to mimic that full frame film. But full frame film isn't as wide as the FX9 sensor. So full frame film isn't this wide. So when we shoot with a 35mm anamorphic lens, what we end up with in the viewfinder is that. But this isn't a problem for the FX9 because of the 6K sensor. Because that sensor is 6K wide, when we crop in, it's still 4K. So we can do this with the FX9, not get any loss in quality. And in fact, if you use the FX9 to shoot anamorphic with a 35mm anamorphic lens, you end up with greater resolution than you get from the most commonly used anamorphic cameras that the manufacturer's name begins with an A and ends with an I, because they have full frame, they have open gate size sensor. Their sensor is taller, but it's lower resolution. It's only a 2.8K sensor. Because this is a 6K sensor, we end up with a lot more resolution, even though we actually have to crop the sides off. If you were to use a 4K sensor, perhaps an FX6, you're going to crop the sides off, and you're going to be 3K, 2.8, 3K resolution, something like that. So for anamorphic, this camera is really actually very, very good. Although at the moment you still need to do the de-squeeze in post-production, and you might want to use a third-party viewfinder until such time as the version 3 firmware comes out, and then you'll be able to use it. So another question that's come in is, how noticeable will the look differ if your shoot was done between cinematic and non-cinematic lens with the FX9? Cinematic is a hugely overused word because it doesn't have a real meaning. What does cinematic mean? Cinematic isn't about a lens. It's not about a camera necessarily. Cinematic is the whole thing. So if you want something to look cinematic, it's lighting. First and foremost, actually, it's lighting. That is the thing that makes the biggest difference. That's what makes most things look cinematic, is great lighting. The lighting that I've got in here in this little office that I'm using isn't fantastic. I've tried to make it look a little bit cinematic, but it doesn't really look cinematic. And that's because of the lighting. Let me just figure out which lights are where. If I just dim this light here quickly, if you want to go a bit more cinematic, maybe I could do something like that. It's a little bit more moody, and maybe that's a bit more cinematic, exactly depending on how you light it. So, you know, cinematic starts with lighting, it starts with composition, it starts with costume. If you want that classic film look, you've got to start thinking about what people are wearing. If you want that teal and orange look, it's not just a post-production thing. You would also look at the clothes that your actors are wearing. In fact, one of the reasons why I use this, I've got two shirts very similar colours to this, is that these particular shades, these blues and the subtle reds in this shirt, I think tend to look nice on video. If I wore a bright purple shirt or a bright orange shirt, it's not going to look as nice on video. So all of those things you have to consider for cinematic filming. This lens here, I would not consider this lens to be a cinema lens because it isn't, it's a photography lens. But if you've composed your shot nicely, framed it nicely, lit it nicely and everything else, it can look very cinematic. Comparing this lens, the Fujinon MK, let's see if the AF on this camera will focus on it. So these are really great lenses. What you tend to get with a lens like this is you do get a clarity and a sharpness to the image that perhaps you don't get with a lower quality lens. In terms of looks, a cinematic lens is just generally a high quality lens. And you can get a cinematic look from any high quality lens. There's nothing necessarily uniquely cinematic about this lens, except really the pitch gears. So we have the gears for focus motors. We have a very large throw for the zoom, so that makes for the focus, so that makes manual focus very, very easy. We have a parfocal zoom, so that means I can zoom in and zoom out, and the focus does not change at all. It's completely rock solid, whereas most photography lenses, most stills lenses, the focus will change. Even if it's only very subtly, it will change when you zoom in and out. And in fact, that's one of the issues with full frame cameras right now. So in terms of the lens choices for full frame, in terms of zoom lenses, there are very, very few. If you want a cinema lens that's full frame and has a good zoom range, so I'm talking of a zoom range more than 3 or 4 times, you have very few options. Perhaps a Fujinon Premista is one of the few options, and a Fujinon Premista, I'd need to move the camera, is a really big lens. It's about that long, it's about that diameter, and I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's 3 or 4 kilos. It's a lot heavier than the camera, and it's a big and expensive lens. And that's only like a 4 times zoom. It's not a huge range. If you want that in Super 35, it's much cheaper. So in fact, actually this is quite close to the equivalent of a Premista lens. So this is an 18 to 55, and I've got to remember now what the Premistas are. I think it's, is it 24 to 80 or something like that. They're very similar zoom ranges. This is a fraction of the weight. It's a tiny fraction of the cost. These lenses I think are about $3,000 currently. The Premista is about $40,000. So getting lenses, good quality, cinema style zoom lenses for full frame is really, really difficult and really, really expensive. And that's simply because when you make that sensor bigger, you've got to have a much bigger front element to get enough light to work with the bigger sensor. And the whole lens becomes far more complicated and much harder to produce, especially if you want the focus to remain constant parfocal. Now Sony do have their 28 to 135mm full frame lens, and really this is a remarkable lens because it gives you a big zoom range, 28 to 135, in full frame, and the focus stays constant, and that's done electronically. So the lens uses electronics to basically create a lens that isn't parfocal. Then the electronics override that and make it electronically parfocal. So there are some limitations. You can't zoom in and out super quickly with it because the focus system can't keep up. But that lens is particularly amazing value for money, and for what you get, it is a really good lens. But if you want a cinema style lens in full frame, be prepared to spend huge money, big money, especially if you want more than 3 times zoom. Go down to Super 35 and suddenly you have all the Fujinon Cabrios available to you. You have the Canon CN7s, and there's a whole range of other Canon lenses as well that are parfocal, and they're not nearly as expensive as the full frame lenses. And again, this is why I really like the FX9, because I can use all of those lenses in 4K on this camera. Can't do that with an FX6. And that's a big, for me, that's actually a really big restriction of the FX6. You are limited, if you want to shoot 4K, largely to DSLR lenses or very expensive lenses. And there's nothing in between. The FX9 gives you a lot broader choice of lenses to be able to shoot at very high quality. So another question is, what are my go-to prime lenses for a cinematic look? Do I prefer the Sony GM lenses? So where I want autofocus, yes, my preference is the Sony GMs. So the 24 to 70, it's a great go-to lens. The 24 to 105 f4 lens, if you need a bit more zoom range, is another really good lens. That's a G. Then we have the primes. Now, in terms of primes, I don't actually have that many because I'm tending to go to cinema lenses. If I have a project that's going to be properly crude and everything else, I still might choose proper PL mount cine lenses. In which case, there's loads of choices from Zeiss, from Arri, from whoever, the Loxias. You've got a huge range of lenses that you can use, and each different brand, each different lens has a different look to it. So if you shoot with the Loxias, they're slightly, I wouldn't call it, it's not blurry, it's not the right word. They have a softer, creamier look to them, perhaps, than if you use the Sigma primes, which are much harder, a much more clinical look. And then, of course, you've got the Cooks, which have a warm look. So a lot of the lens choice is about how do you want it to look, and then you choose the lens that's appropriate for the look for that production. As a general all-round lens, then yes, I'd probably go with the GMs, because the autofocus, you know it's going to work. You know it's going to work with the camera. They're reliable, they're well built, they're optically very good, and they are great lenses. The only other options in the primes is actually on a budget. I actually still quite like the old Rokinon Xenes. Value for money, they're great. A really, it's not the best lens in the world, I'm not saying that at all, but in terms of bang for your buck and things like that, you get a lot of lens for the money. So if you want to buy a set of lenses, that is an option to explore, but obviously there's no autofocus there, so you have to decide, do you want autofocus or not? There's no one fits all answer to that question. It depends on what you need. Do you need autofocus, or do you need all the proper pitch gears with a big focus range and everything else? And actually this is why I keep coming back actually to the FX9 and not the FX6, is because I've got the pair of these, and these are great lenses. Effectively, you can use these as primes. Optically, they're as good as a lot of very high quality prime lenses. You don't have to zoom in and out. You can just use it shooting at 18 millimeters, at 35 millimeters, and at 50 millimeters, and use it as 3 different prime lenses. And in terms of value for money, it's great, because I can buy the 2 of these for around about $6,000–7,000. I'm not sure what the current prices are, and I can cover everything from 18 millimeters to 135 millimeters at a cinema type quality, with all the pitch gears, follow focus, really easy to use for manual focus. But if I'm doing a different project where I want autofocus, then it's going to be the Sony GMs. And that's where I would go, because that's what I want. So actually we've overrun a little bit. I've exceeded my allocated time. I've covered everything I wanted to talk about, and a little bit more, which is great. So I don't have to dash off in a big hurry. So I have some time for questions. So I know there can be a little bit of a lag between you typing your question in and me seeing it on my screen here. So actually I've got a couple of other questions that have come in that I can see, just going through my list. When I did the anamorphic shoot with the earlier firmware, how did I manage the D-squeeze in the monitoring? Yeah, and that's a really good question, because when I shot that film, there's no D-squeeze in the viewfinder. I actually shot a lot of it just like this, and just put up with the fact that my image was stretched in the viewfinder. You can do that. You can shoot that way if you want. One thing to be really careful of with anamorphic lenses is that, because the anamorphic lens has it's called a cylinder lens in it, the back focus of the lens can be very slightly different, or very slightly out, for horizontal and vertical. So most of these lenses are PL mount, so you're going to have to use a PL mount adapter. And it's really super important that you shim that PL mount adapter for the lens set that you're using, because if the back focus is out by even the tiniest amount, and a lot of the really cheap PL adapters, the back focus isn't right, what happens is that the focus horizontally is slightly different to the focus vertically. So you actually have 2 points of focus. As you go in, you'll find that you get 1 point of focus, which is when your verticals are in focus, and then you go through that and then your horizontals come into focus. So it's really important for anamorphic to make sure that you have a PL mount that has the correct back focus distance, and that might mean you need to shim it. I use the Vocus PL mount because you can put shims in the back of that. Now, if you don't have D-squeeze, what happens there is it can be a little bit, it's difficult to see that the two focuses coming together at the same time. So the other option you've got until version 3 comes out is with a third-party viewfinder or monitor. Now, I had an Atomos Ninja on the camera as well, Ninja 5, and the Ninja 5 has D-squeeze, so I could use that with the D-squeeze to monitor at the correct aspect ratio, and that was a huge help. You could also use maybe a Zacuto Gratical viewfinder. There are lots of third-party viewfinder options that have D-squeeze right now, and that's all you need until version 3 comes, and then you won't need those, and you'll be able to do it in the camera, nice D-squeeze in the viewfinder, and I'm really looking forward to that coming because I love shooting anamorphic. The look that you get is quite unique, and it's very pleasing to shoot with. So could I elucidate some of the dynamic range differences between the 3 different FX models, or does none exist? There is, to be perfectly honest, I mean, I own the FX3, the FX6 and the FX9, and there is virtually no difference. The difference is so small, it's not worth worrying about. The FX6 and the FX3 at high base ISO, so when you're using 12,800 ISO, their dynamic range does drop away a little bit. It's not big, it's tiny, but because there is quite a bit of there's definitely more noise at 12,800 ISO than there is at 800 ISO in those cameras, and that noise causes you to lose some of your dynamic range in the shadows, and there's a very slight fall off in the highlight dynamic range as well. It's a fraction of a stop, but it is there. So in the dual base ISO, if you're using the high base ISO with the FX3 and FX6, there is some drop off in the dynamic range. With the FX9, between the low base and the high base, the dynamic range remains completely the same. There's no difference. So there's a very subtle difference, but it's really not worth bothering about. And if you are using them together, so if I've got to use my FX9 and my FX6 or FX3 together as a B camera or C camera or however I'm using them, in terms of white balance and making them match, what I found to be really important is to white balance with a white card, is to not rely on the presets, because if you dial in exactly the same preset Kelvin numbers to the cameras, they are very, very close. They're not miles apart by any means, but there can be differences. I mean, sometimes those differences just come from the lens that you're using. A lens can change your white balance. So I prefer to white balance with a white target, all of the cameras at the same time off that same white card, and then they match. And I can shoot FX9 S-Cinetone, FX3 X-Cinetone, FX6 S-Cinetone or S-Log3, white balance that way, and I have no problem cutting between those cameras. Nobody would notice that you're using 3 different cameras. They are really, to all intents and purposes, the same. If you really dig deep, very deep into the data and everything like that, there are some very subtle differences. But provided you white balance properly, nobody's ever going to notice those, so it's fine. What would I improve on the camera if I could? It's no secret, is it, that the FX6 has 120 frames per second in 4K, and the only way you can do 120 frames per second in 4K with this camera is via the RAW output, and that means the XDCA on the back and an external recorder. It's a bit more of a bulky, cumbersome solution. So in a perfect world, it would be nice if that was possible. It's not going to happen. Don't get your hopes up. This is a different sensor. It prioritizes different things. So this prioritizes having that 6K oversampling, giving you that optimum image quality, allowing you to shoot 4K Super 35. This camera, if you're doing news and current affairs with the XDCA on the back, you've got the dual dongle slots and QoS streaming, so you can do your news stories live, direct to the studio, in broadcast quality without needing a satellite uplink truck and all of those things. You can record S-Log3 in 4K with no LUT on it, and at the same time record broadcast quality MPEG-2 HD with the LUT baked into it. So if you're doing maybe you're doing a feature where there's a breaking news story that you're going to follow up with a documentary, you have the ability with the one camera to have that output with the LUT on it, or that recording with the LUT baked in, that you can use for your direct-to-air or your immediate use without any grading or anything else. But at the same time, you have the 4K S-Log3 recording that you can then use in the documentary later on when you've got the time to do the grading and to do a nicer job. So the cameras are slightly different in their priorities and what they do. And this camera sort of really prioritizes the broadest range of flexibility. So I can use it for news and do a live news story with it. I can use it for a drama and shoot 35mm with PL lenses. I'll be able to shoot anamorphic with it and all of those things. And the slow motion function is it's a bit of an add-on with this camera. Whereas the FX6 is more aimed at perhaps a VJ or somebody that does little shorts for YouTube and things like that, where maybe the whole of the film is shot in slow motion and stuff like that, and in which case it does a good job. But if you want a general sort of all-rounder camera, I think still the FX9 has a lot of things. And things like as well, so we have this camera's XQD cards, and if you look at the user groups, you'll see with the FX6 and FX3 many more instances of card problems, of media issues, where a card doesn't work for some reason, that a certain brand of card doesn't work, or that a recording's become corrupted, because SD cards, which those cameras use, is consumer media. This isn't professional high-speed media. And if you're running SD cards in those cameras, they just aren't as reliable. XQD cards, you look at the forums and the user groups, and the cases of XQD cards failing or going wrong are extremely rare. In fact, most cases it's user error. It's somebody's done something wrong. So this all comes down to, what do you need? This is your broadcast camera. The other cameras are more for sort of YouTube type productions and things like that, which they do extremely well, don't get me wrong. We have interlaced output on this camera. We don't have interlaced recording on this camera. You don't have interlaced recording on the FX6 or FX3. So a couple more questions. When I'm using the Ninja for the monitoring D-squeeze, was I able to put guide frames on your final intended aspect ratio? Yes, I was. And if I remember right, I think I did. When I shot the Anamorphic, that film that you saw, it was a while back. It was end of last summer. Yeah, the feature set really wasn't there. I mean, the other way to do guide frames, of course, is you can create your own guide frames in the FX9. So you could put the guide frames on in the FX9, and there you can have those appearing on your SDI out on the Ninja. So, and I think actually that's how I did it. Is I think I created my own custom guide frames in the FX9, so that when I was using just the viewfinder of the FX9, I had guide frames in there, and then those are fed out on the SDI to the monitor. When using the higher sensitivity modes on the cameras, is there any way to lower the ISO below the recommended setting, e.g. 12,800? And if not, is there a way to affect a pull? Yeah, so I touched on this earlier, that with the FX6 and FX3, that 12,800 ISO for so many things is too high. You know, the 4,000 ISO that you have with this camera for log, for so many things is actually just right. You know, if you're shooting in a very low light, you're doing that moody, romantic bedroom scene, or perhaps a scene of somebody in a room watching television at night. 4,000 ISO tends to be perfect for that. 12,800 is just too high. The TV screen overexposes, all your practical lights and everything overexpose. But you've got an ND filter. You know, this camera has an ND filter, so does the FX6. Use the ND filter. You know, you have ND filters are not just there for when you're shooting in extremely bright light. ND filters are for whenever you have too much light. And if the camera's at 4000 ISO and that's one stop or two stops too much, you can put in a couple of stops of ND. If you're using the FX6, you can put in a couple of stops of ND at 12,800 ISO. And if you think about the camera as a whole, and if we think about the ND that's built into the camera as changing the sensitivity of the camera as a whole, not the sensor, but the whole camera. If you use a quarter ND on this camera, it makes the camera 2 stops less sensitive. So if we're at 4000 ISO, that brings us down to 2000, it's 1000 ISO. If I was using an FX6, put 2 stops of ND in it at 12,800, so we halve 12,800 at 6,400, halve it again, 3,200. So the overall camera becomes 3,200 ISO. And if you wanted, it's up to you how you do this, you could put 3,200 ISO in your light meter, the camera at 12,800 ISO with 2 stops of ND, and then take your shutter speed and aperture readings off the light meter for 3,200, put that into your lens, and you'll have the correct exposure. So the ND filter is the way to do it, you know, and that's what it's there for. That's the best way to do it, is to use the ND filter. So I don't see any more questions. I think that is all of them. So I hope you enjoyed the session. I hope there was some useful information in there. And with that, I think we're back to Aaron.